Great, thanks very much, Joss, and it's good to be back here. It really was a pleasure working with Tessa and Vanessa and Joss on that exhibition. It was a unique opportunity for me, and it was a blast. It really was a blast. Thanks also to Joss. A number of the slides that you'll see, especially in the second half of the lecture, some of them come from downstairs, some of them Joss did, picked out specially so that the lecture would complement more effectively the lovely exhibition downstairs. And I noticed there's a squeaky floorboard under my foot, which is just exactly the way the world always is. I bet you all know that. Hi, you can't hear. Right. Dwayne Hanson, The Tourist. Gallery of Modern Art. Free. What are they looking at? You might find out. So, types of traveller. Tourism, the word, is first coined in English in the early 19th century and is defined by the OED as travelling for pleasure. More broadly, according to Alistair Dury, who did a very good book on the hydropathic institutions of the 19th and 20th century, tourism is an industry of the past for both the present and the future. Early British tourism is travel for pleasure by Brits within Britain. Visitors from overseas are very rare. The historiographer royal for Scotland, Christopher Smout, I'm sure you know his books, estimates that around 1800 there's probably only 20 or 30 foreign visitors to Scotland travelling for pleasure. Most people travel for work. It's a myth that until the coming of railways and bicycles, people didn't move around, because they most certainly did, often over short distances, but there's also considerable seasonal and permanent migration within Scotland. So basically merchants, seamen, soldiers, labourers and servants. Being a servant was what most people did between the age of roughly 15 and 25. Difficult, dangerous, expensive and exotic. Travel is not something you undertook lightly. Foreigners who did visit, the very few, included the famous one of the architects of the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, who visited Scotland twice as an intellectual tourist in 1759 and 1771. And if you think about it, tourists describes a spectrum of involvements with societies and cultures. You can be working at one minute, you can be doing something for pleasure at the next. There's multiple possibilities, no hard and fast boundaries. To me, the first mass tourists were pilgrims. And indeed, the word holiday comes from the holy day, which there were about 30, depending what country you were in and what date in the year, plus, of course, Sundays, which weren't supposed to be for work. What is a pilgrim? Another OED definition: someone who performed conventionalized acts to show respect towards places, people and ideas. And that could be just about anybody. In fact, it could even be people who come to an Oasis concert. Slow travel with strangers, which is what pilgrims do, allows for both spiritual and physical regeneration. There must be a recreational dimension to it. Wonderfully evoked, you'll all have heard and probably read some of the Canterbury Tales that Chaucer wrote way back in the 14th century to celebrate the broad spectrum of people who went on pilgrimage. All Britain's early cathedrals had relics of the ancient church, or the early Christian church, mostly body parts. St Andrews is, of course, a famous example, and the saint's remains were brought to what should properly be pronounced as Kilrement, but if you say that to the locals, they'll think you're a stranger, because they all say Kilriment. So they were brought in the 1700s, At the instigation of the Augustinians, the town was renamed in the, I think it was in the 1000s, and pilgrimages took off from the end of the 1000s. They died across most of Britain and northwestern Europe. They actually die out during the 15th century, but formally ended by the Reformation in 1559. Now, they're important because they bring with them infrastructure changes. They're a money spinner, which is why the Augustinians wanted the place renamed, and a reason for infrastructure improvements, including those by Queen, later St. Margaret, the ferry at Queensferry, and also hostels en route. And that makes an interesting and important point that's enduring nowadays. Tourism creates and transforms places. And I'll look at some of those transformations in the lecture. There's a map of St Andrews, which you'll all know. It's not a map, is it? It's an aspect. So there you've got the cathedral. That's the castle, St Salvator's Chapel, and other important landmarks like, you can't see it in this definition, but they're clearly visible in the original. Tesco, I think, is there, and Boots is just about there. Now, scholastic or academic tourism. I like academic tourism. Christian Europe before Luther was religiously unified. Virtually everybody, more than 99% of people were Christians, unified under the Universal Catholic Church. The other unifying factor in Europe, which was very diverse, in 1500 there were 500 political entities in Europe. Nowadays there's about 30, I think. The other unifying factor is Latin. Latin's the universal language of learning and of diplomacy until the vernacular is more used in the 18th century and French took over as the language of diplomacy. Reading, speaking and writing Latin was the basis of post-elementary education, and it's the basis of university education, again up to the 18th century. All you needed to get into university is a pocket full of money and the ability to speak, read and write Latin, or a letter from somebody that attested to that. And there were dozens of universities in Europe even before 1500. Lots of student mobility. It's not something that's new, right up to the time of the Reformation. The movement is on the basis of the things I've listed there, but also personal preference. And it's a lovely phrase that, the peregrinatio academica, academic wandering. I like wandering. And surprise, surprise, French, Spanish and Italian universities were all very popular with Scots. I mean, there was St Andrews, obviously, from 1411, but St Andrews wasn't too bad in the 16th and the early 17th centuries. It kind of fell on hard times for a couple of centuries. And even after the Reformation, Protestant universities and a network of Protestant universities grew up around Protestant Europe, and that revives the peregrinatio in an age when people possibly didn't want to go to somewhere in a Catholic country. Much better known is probably the Grand Tour, which really is going abroad for pleasure. Pilgrims from all walks of life, students or niche, young people, teenagers, people in their 20s. Most early tourists are wealthy men, leisured members of the landed classes with pots of money to spend. And they went around Europe in the 16th, 17th, and especially the 18th centuries in pursuit of art, antiquities, and culture. And, of course, as much sex as they could pay for. One of them is Tobias Smollett, who, some of his books, he wrote picaresque novels apart from travel works. He was the son of a Scottish judge and landowner, independent means, so he travelled quite a lot. And his travels through France and Italy were one of the earliest tourist guides or tourist books that I ever read, and I thought they were absolutely brilliant, scathingly hilarious. Basically a large collection of xenophobic prejudices. The message he gave was that overseas travel was uncomfortable and disagreeable, and there was no getting away from that. And the reason was because the continent of Europe was populated by foreigners. They're just there to rip you off and make fun of you and talk about you behind your back in some inexplicable lingo. But at the same time, you could see that in Smollett's writing that his encounters with these people, much as he didn't really like them, forced him to think about Britain. In Smollett's case, it made him glad to be British. Boswell and Johnson, whose famous tour of the Western Isles of Scotland you probably also know, to me fall into the same camp. I think James Boswell was fine as long as he got his leg over regularly. Samuel Johnson seemed to be absolutely miserable for most of the journey in the Western Isles. There is a grand tourist. I'm not saying that man is a sex tourist, by the way. That's in Fyvie Castle, National Trust property, Fyvie Castle. Brilliant painting. You could talk for half an hour about that, about the symbolism within that painting. So the grand tour kind of dies out, starts to die out even at its height during the 18th century because of all the wars in Europe. Britain fought the Second 100 Years' War with France between 1689 and 1815, and more people were encouraged to stay home, partly as a mark of patriotism. There's kind of a staycation mentality, why go abroad and be ripped off when at least you know you're being ripped off by your peers within the island of Britain. Now, improvements in transport and accommodation made leisure travel easier. One of the main points that's made in that exhibition downstairs, if you haven't seen it, is that it did take a long time to get anywhere until the 18th century, and the railways changed things quite a lot in the 19th century. These are English figures, but you could transpose them to Scotland. London to Bath in 1680 took roughly 60 hours by coach. So that's basically nearly 3 days of travel. 3 days of travel to go 120 miles, which would require some dedication, I think. Now, by 1750, turnpikes, which are toll roads, have reduced that to about 36 hours. I know that's walking pace because for the next set of figures, I just put all this into Google directions, and you get different options. So that's walking pace, but it's walking pace on modern roads. Actually, I was going to say you could walk along the M4, but you would die. So 2025, according to Google, an hour and 20 minutes by train, and 2.5 hours by car, which is obviously dependent on traffic. So domestic travel was definitely becoming easier even before the trains. Undertaken by men and women alike, Dorothy Wordsworth mentioned downstairs her trip to Scotland. Essentially a search for knowledge by antiquarians, journalists, and what I've called economists, but we would probably call political economists, of whom probably the most famous is Daniel Defoe, his tour through the whole island of Great Britain, which he really did visit Scotland and Wales and what have you as a government spy. Less well known, but a really good read, is the Diary of Celia Fiennes, Through England on a Side Saddle. And she did various tours around England, including the Lake District, and she came from the Midlands, more around the Midlands, I suppose. Interesting, she really did travel partly for pleasure, partly for medicinal reasons, because she suffered from melancholy, what was called melancholy back in the day. And she wrote that it helped her with her depression, or what she called her epidemic diseases of vapours. That's a waymarker. featuring Celia with a big hat and a big skirt. Now, these people were mostly, if not exclusively, interested in towns. Most travellers who wrote and published wrote about urban life. They talked about the principal buildings, commerce, and industry. And they sometimes provided ground plans of significant buildings like churches or fortifications. That's Defoe and his spying. Women travellers wrote a bit about that, but they also did things like dress, manners, and customs. And for a social historian, their writings are invariably more interesting. Towns were about what was known in the 17th century as civility, which means something different to us, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Civility was about places that were socially and politically ordered and epitomised civilization. And in the 17th century, that meant towns. And indeed, most foreign visitors that came to Britain made a beeline for London and stayed there. And as you'll find out in the last slide, that's still what they do. The seat of government has been the biggest town in Britain for at least the last 1,000 years. And it's an important magnet for British people. My research supervisor once famously estimated that one English adult in 6 alive in 1700 had experience of living and working in London. Many more people probably visited it for recreation, leisure, access to legal facilities and so on. And post-1707, the Union, Scots flocked to London looking for work and became the butt of stereotypical jokes and placards about jocks on the make. Now that started to change after 1750. People were still interested in towns, and as I've hinted, they still are, obviously. Not interested in Edinburgh. But after 1750, landscapes became more important, the countryside. So urban tourism remained important, as indeed it did in 19th century Edinburgh. Civility changed in its meaning to mean politeness, courtesy, and consideration, and that's how we use the word nowadays. It also meant culture and refinement, and that meant a growing appreciation of the natural as well as the artificial world. Now, as late as 1743, a correspondent called Charles Littleton wrote of the Peak District as a set of barbarous mountains. Barbarous mountains. People pay good money to go to the peaks nowadays. A generation later, in other words, by the end of the 18th century, the period of the Romantic Revival, writers were actually celebrating these apparently primeval areas of Britain. Now, the reason is partly because Britain industrialised and urbanised very rapidly during the 18th century. And perhaps as a counterbalance, images and representations of the more remote rural parts became increasingly important and a fundamental part of 19th and 20th century tourism. And the reason is, according to the antiquarians and the other semi-academic writers of the late 18th and early 19th century, was that they thought that going to these areas allowed them, if you like, to step back in time. So the idea was that the more geographically remote you got from urbanization and industrialization, the more likely you were to find some form of primitive, authentically British values. Surprised that Reform UK hasn't actually latched onto that yet, but maybe soon. Somebody, and I've forgotten who this was, wrote of this as looking for charmingly backward hangovers from an age of uncorrupted simplicity. And that's explicitly what Boswell and Johnson were doing when they went to the Western Isles. the importance of this is that the Georgians, in other words, the people who lived between 1714 and the advent of Queen Victoria in 1837, the Georgians created a set of what you could call rustic theme parks. Where do you find these rustic theme parks? I can think of no better map than that one. And that's national parks now, based on the National Park and Access to the Countryside Act of 1949 of the Westminster Parliament, and the two national parks in Scotland enabled by the 2000 Act of the Scottish Parliament. The only place that isn't there is Skye, which of course is one of the places that was in the frame to be the latest rustic theme park. But these places are all being written about extensively in guidebooks, which I'll talk about in a minute, by the end of the 18th century. So, changes underfoot. Fog in the Channel, that's one that's in the exhibition downstairs, that golf, the ages of golf. So, what I'm trying to say here is that there are changing cultural conventions which altered travellers' interests, what tourists wanted to do and how they wanted to see it. Practical constraints, obviously, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, 1793 to 1815, did effectively close off a good part of Western Europe. And domestic tourism boomed, especially to rural locations. The real growth in the late 18th, early 19th century is rural locations. So that's activities like walking, golf and cycling, those mostly from the 1870s onwards. That cute little ticket that just appeared, that was engineered by Joss. It's really sweet. Health tourism. There were places like Bath and Harrogate and Tunbridge Wells in the 17th century in England. The big growth in health tourism in Scotland was in the 19th and early 20th century with the hydros, the famous hydropathic institutions, which you can find in places like Crieff, Dunblane and Peebles. United Kingdom's wild spaces became increasingly popular, and that basically means Wales, Highlands, Scotland, north of England, Dartmoor, to a much lesser extent Ireland. Ireland's didn't get a very good press as a tourist destination right up to the early 20th century. The Highlands, again, this point is made downstairs, were opened up by roads built by the military in the aftermath of the suppression of the 1715 Jacobite rebellion right up to the 1750s. I'll show you a little map of that in a second. Commercial provision for travellers flourished as a result. So inns, excursions, music and dance displays like Highland Games, commercialised Highland Games, emerged from the middle of the 19th century. Part of the first great consumer revolution, in probably the first true mass consumer revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. That's the military roads, mostly built, as I say, between the 1720s and the 1750s, and some of the forts like Burner at Glenelg, Fort George, built after 1746 to cow the Highlands. Fort Augustus, it's not on the map, but Riven's another one. And that's Drovers Inn, you might know that, on the coast of Loch Lomond, on the shore of Loch Lomond. Right, so why am I telling you this? Well, the Highlands, especially for the Hanoverians, was a problem, as it had been for the Romans, the English, and even lowland Scots before 1746. Poor, overpopulated, dangerous, difficult. They spoke a different language, they had clans, they did things differently. They came down and they stole the cattle. Right, so yes, enduringly perceived as different. Now, everybody knows about the suppression of things Highland after 1746, the suppression of carrying of arms, speaking Gaelic in public, certain types of tartan, and so on. Less commonly known is the efforts made by landowners from the 1770s onwards to promote Highland culture and resources, exemplified in the work of the Highlands Society of London, which is comprised of a bunch of Scottish aristocrats who hung out in London during the social season. So, instead of seeing the Highlands as a problem, they say, hey, look, we've got a bunch of places overpopulated, sure, but these people, the blokes who have grown up in a martial tradition, use them in the army. You've got this big empire, you need to have somebody to fight your wars, and this is it. We've got wood. We've increasingly got wool. So they promoted Highland culture and resources, and Walter Scott did the same when he organised the visit of George IV in 1822, the first visit of a Scottish monarch to Scotland, of a British monarch to Scotland since Charles II visited in 1651, and he was on the run from Cromwell. Now, both of these guys and the Highland Society, why did I say both of these guys? Oh yeah, Stevenson's on the cut from the same cloth. They all stressed the complementarity of Highland and Lowland Scotland rather than the difference. So they're saying Highlands are different, but with the sort of headspace that the Lowlanders have, you've got a very powerful combination. And as you all know, the Highlands got the seal of approval from Queen Victoria. Balmoral Castle in the 1850s. She was one of those who didn't think very much of Ireland at all, though she did visit. Now, Queen Victoria gave it the seal of approval, became a kind of aristocratic play park in the late 19th century. One of the side effects of the clearances was to create huge fishing and hunting estates for the moneyed classes. And I was astonished to discover that today, something like a fifth of Scotland's land, admittedly upland and not very useful for much else, is made up of deer or grouse moor, which is extraordinary because it's actually bigger than Northern Ireland, the whole area of Northern Ireland. Now, the process that I'm describing here has variously been described as creating Caledonia, tartanizing, or my own favourite, balmoralising. And what this means is that there was, in the late 18th and especially the 19th century, a process in which Scotland was equated with the Highlands, and the Highlands stood in for the whole of Scotland. So the image that we have nowadays, a lot of tourists have nowadays, was created between the end of the 18th century and the end of the 19th century. These are downstairs as well. There are advertisements from the Edwardian period for Melrose. And there's Walter Scott. Now, obviously, Abbotsford is not far from Melrose, but Scott is very important in the Balmoralisation, though he was before Balmoral, the tartanisation of Scotland, including designing outfits for a man who sadly wasn't around long enough to benefit from weight loss drugs. He's what my wife would call a fine figure of a man. And Scott decked him out in all this gear. In some of the pictures, he's wearing flesh-coloured tights. Yes, right. So, guidebooks, what to see and how to see it. Guidebooks originated as cartography for travellers. The father of the modern guidebook seems to be widely regarded as John Ogilvy, who wrote something called the Britannia, an illustration of England and Wales, first published in 1675, went through multiple editions in the century afterwards. He provided 100 strip maps, and it was widely imitated in the following century. A century later, there's dozens of books being produced for travellers, many of them with maps, a lot of them with descriptions, of which the detail is rather interesting. They're essentially tour guides, works of topography and topographical prints. Poetry even. William Wordsworth made Lake District tourism. The late 18th century book, again, that historians of this topic seem to regard as seminal is Gilpin's Observations on the River Wye, which is in the Welsh Marches. It's one of many volumes that Gilpin published focusing on the landscape. Gilpin didn't do towns at all. He knew that the market really was for people who wanted to do the landscape. Like all good guidebooks, he told people how to get there. He told people where it was and where exactly they should go so they got just exactly the right view. But importantly, and this is the innovation, he instructed people in how to think about what they saw. He taught them about their sensibilities and encouraged them to get in touch with them. So, he advised people how to feel about a loch, or how to feel about a mountain, how to feel about a view. And there's some more examples from downstairs of the equation of the Highlands with Scotland. That's how the Highlands were advertised in the late 19th and early 20th. That's how Scotland was broadly advertised in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that gets us on to a phrase which I do sometimes cringe at when tourists use it in front of me. What am I seeing here? It's known as the tourist gaze from a sociologist. So, why am I seeing it? What do I need to know about this? And how should I feel about it? Why is it relevant to me? 18th century writers saw culture, history, and sometimes legends and what you and I would call myths woven into the landscape. And again, like I said earlier, they emphasized how different the rural areas were, the distant areas were, how different they were from England. And the 20th century expanded this tradition. And 20th century guidebooks are expanded through the input of research by geographers, anthropologists, and archaeologists. And together, they created, between the end of the 18th century and the present day, a new language of tourist expectations, which helped to enrich, explain, express the images and experiences that we could take from a tourist destination. And that's called by John Ury the tourist gaze. And to me, modern guidebooks and social media almost prescribe what to visit and how to see it. And I'm sure you've all been to places and you see people trying to appreciate and quite often failing. I won't mention anywhere, I've got my favourites, but be no xenophobic prejudices here. So, what I'm saying is that the standard modern tour of Scotland was well established by the mid-19th century, and so too was a developing sense of the standardised tourist gaze. Scotland was created as much as it was natural. And there is a gorgeously twee postcard. It's a shame that one's not available for free downstairs. That's sweet. It's what art historians would call the naive style. So who were the early foreign tourists? Right, most early leisure travellers, full stop, as I said earlier on, most early travellers, full stop, are wealthy. Those from abroad are certainly so. Around 1900, I got this again from Smoke, most foreign visitors to Britain came from the USA or Canada. And that's grown from just a few dozen up to a five-figure sum, Smoke reckons, by 1900. Post-bellum, post-Civil War American tourists for pleasure were mainly classed in the shipping records as professionals, like lawyer, people described as merchants, but they were really brokers, not merchant in the sense of a shopkeeper, or simply described as lady or gentleman. So you're talking, serious moneyed classes. And the places like the North British across the street from here, now known as the Balmoral, were built to service this social class in the late Victorian and the Edwardian period. And the Caledonian at the other end of Princes Street, that red sandstone edifice. The American elite emphasis remained right up to World War II. Most long-distance travel was by rail and or boat. Air travel was extremely expensive. There was a major expansion of aviation only in North America during the 1950s. And it was the deregulation of the US airline industry in 1978 that initiated a new global era of mass travel by air. Freddie Laker for the Brits, yeah. Standby fares and things like that. Before that, it was incredibly expensive. My father was a mining engineer, and when we left India, when I was a baby in 1958, was I a baby? No, a bit older. He moved to West Africa, and a couple of times for leaves he would come home and then would go back. Usually we went by boat. And the last time we went by air, it was just my mother and I, and we went and spent the school holiday with my father in Ghana. Right, passports, that was a piece of self-indulgence, and what's the point in being a university lecturer if you can't indulge yourself? Right, passports, it's actually going very well actually. We might even finish on time, which is almost unique for my lectures. Passports are essential to modern travel. You lose them, it's a serious problem. It's a serious and enduring problem. And they're the ultimate proof of national identity. The modern form were mostly used by diplomats until the 19th century. And they comprise generic letters of introduction from one government to another. So it's just for a handful of diplomats. Passports were issued, but they were issued by governments to people who were not their nationals. And the reason was so that they could control what was going on. So most people probably knew that Defoe was a spy, so if he went to France, he would be spying. So he would go and ask for accreditation, just to keep himself straight, and so they knew he was in the country. So it's a way of controlling movement into and within a foreign state. What we call passports, documents attesting to individual national identity, are really only from the 1850s. The result of the growth of commerce and tourism between Britain and the world, and the solidification of nation states and their boundaries in Europe, nationalism during the 19th century. So the British passports that have been issued since the middle of Victoria's reign are for the right to travel under the protection of the British government. And back in the day, the government would send a gunboat if British citizens' interests were meddled with. Nowadays, everyone else has got bigger gunboats, so it doesn't really work anymore. That's an example of what I'll call in a moment the dawn of modern mass tourism. That's from the early 19th century, from the Edwardian era. But if you have a look at those people, these people are irrevocably middle class. They look like, professionals, prosperous shopkeepers and industrialists. Maybe not landed gentry or aristocrats like the 19th century, but they're still not true mass tourists. Right, I think there's only two and a bit more substantive slides. The dawn of mass tourism. Steamers and railways started the democratisation of tourism in the early 19th century. Thomas Cook, who's mentioned downstairs, claimed to have put 40,000 people on his tours in Scotland between 1846 and 1861. And railways and tourism became synonymous for a century and a half, right up to the advent of mass car ownership. That's an example from England. I was amazed to discover that just after the First World War, somewhere near 2 billion passenger rail journeys a year were recorded in Britain. It's an extraordinary figure which wasn't equalled again until the early years of the 21st century. That's for work and play, it's not just for travelling for pleasure. As late as the 1960s, very few Brits went overseas on holiday. Very much a centuries-old pattern. The urban working class did seasonal agricultural work like fruit picking, or Highlanders used to come down to the lowlands to work in the harvest, the grain harvest. And the middle class visited family and friends, or like the people you've just seen there, they went to the seaside. Automobile ownership certainly improved the opportunities for domestic tourism, though it's worth bearing in mind that it used to take forever to drive anywhere in Scotland. If you look around, you've seen all these little side, you see nice big roads now, big 2-lane blacktops, and you see these little tiny single-track roads over on the one side. They look like lay-bys. They're actually the old roads that existed there until the 1980s. It used to take 3 or 4 hours longer than you would think nowadays, especially to move around the Highlands. So 1 million vehicles on Britain's roads in 1930. I was amazed by that number. But only 60% were cars in a population of just under 50 million. 38 million vehicles today, of which 85% are cars, in a population that's only grown by a half. These are advertisements for... Let's really quaint that. First and third class. Remember, there used to be first, second and third class. British Railways got rid of third class. I think it was in 1956. It's still there, but it's not called third class. So the dawn of mass tourism in Britain too. What changed? What created true mass tourism in our terms? Economic growth and changing political priorities are certainly important. The hours worked by your average British adult of working age halved between 1900 and 2000. Helped by things like the Saturday half-day holiday that was instituted in the 19th century. Until then, people were expected to work 6 days a week. And some occupations, remember I mentioned servants earlier on, servants have no set hours. It can be completely open-ended. It's like, what was that film again, that program? Downton. Real incomes also rose by a half between 1900 and 2000. So people had more money to spend.